Welcome back to Equal Time Soccer. I'm Matt Pravratsky alongside my brother Mark, and we are here for the second week in a row of a hardcore deep dive into the data and methodology that drive some of our NCAA selections. We are here with an expert, Chris Thomas. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So, for those who don't know, Chris is one of the several accounts I've leaned on for a long time to not only appreciate just the basics of how the RPI gets calculated and how maybe, a team like Minnesota this year was more firmly in the tournament field as the season went on, but historically they've been a hardcore bubble team in my time covering them. And so Chris is one of the expert folks nationally who help folks like me understand how this all works by being an expert, not just in the RPI, but also trying to predict how the bracket might fall. I guess first, Chris, I'd love to ask you how you originally got into this work.
Well, I'm an antique in terms of college soccer fans at this point, but I actually played soccer when I was a kid. I grew up in Philadelphia, and they had some school soccer there. So I played in high school, and then I played in college, and then moved from Philadelphia out to Portland, Oregon, and got back into soccer. I played a little adult soccer, but I mostly got back in because the University of Portland is near here. And
Yep.
back in the day, they were one of the perennial top teams in the country, won 2 national championships. The women did.
Yep.
And I became a fan of their team and of women's soccer generally back when they had Christine Sinclair, Megan Rapinoe.
Yep.
Believe it or not, the two of them were on the same team.
Yep. We
For
have
1 year, a couple of national championships.
And Chris, I don't know if you know this, but Danny Foxhoven Young, proud Portland alum, is a big friend of Equal Time. We love Danny Foxhoven. So I don't know if you also remember cheering her on.
Oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, she had an interesting professional soccer history.
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, in 2007, I wasn't a big University of Oregon fan, but the University of Oregon women came in second in the Pac, whatever it was then, Pac 8, I think.
Yep.
And they didn't get into the NCAA tournament, which was pretty shocking to me. So I decided I got to figure out why this happened. I was just curious. And I knew the NCAA used the RPI, rating percentage index. And so I decided to figure out what the formula was and how it worked.
Right.
Well, back then, part of the formula was secret. They had bonuses and penalties, but they never disclosed what they were. And they didn't publish ratings back then. Now they publish the ratings.
Right.
Just the ranks. So I spent about a year trying to crack the formula, which people thought was impossible. And I actually cracked it.
Yeah.
And it was totally lucky. Well, then about 2 years later, they started publishing the ratings, and it's like, oh, now it's so much easier.
Right.
So I got into tracking the RPI and how it worked. And I did it mostly, I created the RPI for Division I women's soccer website.
Yep.
Mostly for fans originally.
Yep.
Well, over time it's evolved. I added to it work I'd done studying the committee's decisions and how they related to the criteria they're supposed to use, and added that to the website. And over time it transformed more actually to a resource for coaches.
Right.
And almost all the big time coaches have been through the website. They use it to understand the RPI.
Right.
They also use it in scheduling.
Yeah.
Because there are some tricks to scheduling because of the structure of the RPI formula.
Right.
So anyway, that's how I got into it. And I'm not trained in programming or using Excel, which is what I use, but I figured it out.
Well, I love that you mentioned the coaches, because actually this fall I made an intention to try and make sure I knew which sources I could confidently have and who I should have on to elevate on a show. And I texted, one of the coaches that I have the best relationship with, who's a, longtime women's soccer coach. And I said, hey, I've been using this guy. Like, do you guys use him? Is he solid? Do you guys rate him? And she said at the time, She remembers at a time when they literally, I think, tried to have you like truly meet with them to sort of like give them pointers on how to schedule to like to get those RPI boosts. Because one joke I made this fall when I was doing a prep call with the Big Ten coach, I've had this sort of running like half joking thing of now that it's an 8-team league, oh, why don't you just do a single table schedule? And one coach sort of did the traditional laugh, like everyone laughs at me, and then said, well, we can't really do that because then you can't, you eat yourself in the RPI because
Right.
and so, but I mean, even just in general, when you talk about something like the RPI, I think general sports fans, if you're like a hardcore sports fan, you're sort of aware of what the RPI is meant to be. Like if you're a men's college basketball fan, you've maybe heard of it. If you follow our stuff, you've seen us reference it. And, it's meant to be sort of a tool to track quality of team, quality of schedule, like all these things in one. But when you that's how I explain it. But when you explain the RPI, how do you explain a metric like that?
The way I explain it is partly how the NCAA does, partly different.
Right.
There are two things you're interested in if you're trying to do a mathematical system that's going to rate teams. One is what their winning record is, or winning percentage as the NCAA calls it. And the other is who did they play? What's their strength of schedule? You can have a great winning percentage, but you played a bunch of cupcakes. It doesn't mean much.
Right.
So what the RPI tries to do is put those two things together and assemble the data from all the teams and compare them all to each other based on that. So in their formula, for example, a team's winning percentage is worth 50% in the effective weight of what their final rating is going to be, and their strength of schedule is worth the other 50%.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they evaluate strength of schedule is to break it into two parts. One is what the winning percentages of your opponents are.
Yep.
Now, if they just did that, you could play opponents who play nothing but cupcakes and they'll have really good winning percentages. It doesn't tell you that much.
Right.
So the other part of strength of schedule is your opponents' winning percentages.
Right.
I'll just throw in briefly here. One of the key problems of the RPI is that the opponent's winning percentage part of strength of schedule accounts for 80% of its effective weight.
Right.
And the opponent's winning percentage, who they played, only accounts for 20%.
Right. So of that 50%, you're saying it's weighted 80-20
Yes.
to the first number versus the latter.
Yeah. So when you're scheduling, if you're a coach, what you really care about is what your opponent's winning percentage is going to be.
Right.
Chris, can I ask you a follow-up? Because I run into this. I work at this Black Art bar as my main job, and I do equal time soccer things. Matt does this as a side gig as well. How do you, when you have family members or friends, you're saying, I'm spending hours now. What have you been doing, Chris? You've been on your computer doing the soccer stuff. How do you describe what you do in a succinct way? Because I try to get better at it. And I try to say, I do women's soccer, podcasting, and writing. And try to, but yours is even a little more niche. How do you tell when you have like a family member, like, what have you been doing all weekend, Chris? How do you
That's a really good question. My granddaughter, who is now in her 20s, says that she calls me coach. Coach's computer game that I don't understand. But I describe what I do. Most of them know I'm a soccer fan, most of my friends. And I just tell them generally what I do. And then I tell them that I do some work purely as a volunteer, helping coaches around the country and occasionally helping conferences. I think I did do a conference with the Big East, I think, was when I'm guessing you were talking about Aaron Chastain earlier.
I actually wasn't, but that's.
Oh, you weren't.
Well, too deep, Matt. There's too many coaches to keep track of it.
I've done work with Aaron, helped her team out before she got to the Big Ten, and I've actually had some communications with her since. She's great, by the way. I love her.
Yeah. Well, Well, then I'm curious too, Chris. You talk about the formula and that sort of 50-50 split, and then the opponent's piece is that 80-20 weight. I had been hearing some this year, your fellow sort of data nerd, Chris Henderson, I think maybe even posted publicly about this, but I saw other people posting too. Were there tweaks this year specifically to that formula? Like the formula you described this year, that was tweaked. Is that right?
Yes, actually, there are two things that are significant that have happened in the last 3 years.
Okay.
2 years ago, they stopped having overtime games during the regular season.
Yep.
So there are more ties. There are twice as many ties as there used to be. There used to be about 10% of games ended as ties. Now about 20% do. The second thing they did was this year, they tweaked the formula, and they did it in two ways. Mm-hmm. Number one, in calculating a team's winning percentage, and this doesn't apply to strength of schedule, which is sort of odd, but in calculating the first element of the RPI, team's winning percentage, they used to value a tie as half a win.
Right.
Now they value it as a third of a win.
Right.
Which means teams that play for ties in their winning percentage get what is closer to a loss than it is to a win.
Right. It's, in other words, it's almost essentially they went from giving it a 500 value like a record to just matching what the point difference is, which is 3-1. Right.
Yes.
Right.
So they did that. If you're the second thing they did was there's a bonus penalty. They calculate the basic RPI, and then you get bonuses for good wins and ties and penalties for bad losses and ties.
Right.
The penalties are sort of irrelevant for practical purposes.
Right.
What they did for the bonuses was they used to give bonuses for wins and ties against teams ranked 1 to 40, and then lesser bonuses for wins and ties against teams ranked 41 to 80. Mm-hmm. Well, they changed the ranges to teams ranked 1 to 25 and teams ranked 26 to 50. And then they added another bonus tier for wins only, not ties, against teams ranked 51 to 100.
Right.
Now, this is significant to something the committee did this year. Their rationale for doing that was when they sit in the committee room, they get spreadsheets from the NCAA on teams. I think they access them online now. They used to get them printed, but the spreadsheets are broken down into opponents who are in the 1 to 25 group, the 26 to 50 group, the 50 to 100, and so on. Mm-hmm. And what they said when they adopted it was they wanted to be using that to communicate out to the teams how they really thought about their decisions in the committee room. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to tell teams it matters to us the level of the team you're playing after we've gotten the RPI, when we're into the sort of next phase of things. Right. That's what we're looking at. Mm-hmm. And if we have time, I'll get to their bubble decisions this year and how they relate to that, because there's a really good explanation for their bubble decisions in their rationale for going to that system.
Yep. Don't worry, Chris. We got nothing but time. Your time is our time. We're ready to go.
Okay.
Where do you read this? Where do you get your source material, Chris? I feel like that. Like, I'm just curious, because is it just NCAA documents? It's like I'm curious because it takes work to do this type of stuff. It's kind of like it's like you said, maybe you're not specialized, but you do the work. So I'm wondering where you find this stuff, because I don't find this stuff.
Well, there's the key sources now that I use are all within the NCAA.
Yeah.
I track through the NCAA.org website, not the .com website is more of the public face, but the .org site is the internal site. And if you learn how to meander around their website, you can get to a Division I women's soccer page. And on that, they have links to the minutes of the committee meetings. They meet a couple of times a year.
Yep.
And so that, for example, is where I first found out that they had changed the formula this year.
Right. Yeah.
So that's one place. A second place is each year around October, they publish what's called the NCAA Division I Women's Soccer Pre-Championship Manual.
Okay.
And you get that through the website too, on the same Division I Women's Soccer page. And that, if there's any other additional information you might need about the championship, about their decision-making process, you can find it there. It's sort of peculiar because if I'm a coach, I won't see, I'm 2/3 of the way through my season before that's published.
Yeah.
Which is sort of crazy. It's like, hey, you ought to be telling me a year in advance what we're going to be doing next year or 2 years.
Yeah.
Now, there's two other places I go. One is the NCAA has a really good system now for capturing game results.
Okay.
And I forget what that's called, but you can go into that. And the teams now almost universally use a specific set of game software.
Yep.
They're using in-game for recording statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way it works is they finish the game, they review it, they push send.
Yep.
And it goes directly into the NCAA system. So
right.
If I'm sitting there looking at their schedule for a particular day, the results of games are getting into that system almost live.
Yep.
So I use that system. And then the other thing they have is something called I don't know if it's still called it, the NCAA archive, RPI archive.
Yep.
And that's where you go to get both weekly, about starting 5 weeks into the season, they publish RPI numbers.
Yep.
And you can go there and get those as soon as they've published them. And then if you use that system, it has, for each team, it has their name, the team's name is a link, but also the rank is a link. And the name link takes you to the team's page where you can see their schedule set out in normal fashion.
Yeah.
And you can actually go from there to a whole bunch of other
data
for the team.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then if you use the number link, you go to what's called a team sheet. Mm-hmm. And that's what the committee is using when they're making their decision. And that's where they've broken down the games they've played into the top 25, 26 to 50, and so on.
Right.
So that's what I use now. And then Chris Henderson has the website he operates.
Yep.
That has games. As he enters games into his system, it immediately regenerates the RPI, and you can go and look at teams' ratings.
Right.
And one of the things I do is now every day during the season when results come in, I draw my results from the NCAA's system. Mm-hmm. And then I go to Chris's system and match my results with his results. And that way I can be, and if there are divergences, I either tell Chris something's wrong in yours, or I tell the NCAA something's wrong in yours. And that way, the three of us, you can always be confident that the three of us, by the end of that process, always will have exactly matching data and ratings.
Yeah. This is the most inside baseball thing of all time, and only 100 people will care about this or fewer. But there's been a really funny online saga where Chris's database went down. Chris Henderson's database went down, and he's been updating via Twitter as he rebuilds it. But as he does it, he keeps quote tweeting Chris Thomas, your stuff, and he keeps like almost like a random, like anytime I post anything and I think it's such a big deal that we didn't do a story or didn't do a show, and it's like only a big deal to us, but we think it's a big deal to the whole world. And Chris keeps quote tweeting your thing and saying like, Chris's thing is saying this, it's saying that. But you can, like, the tweets all have this angst of like, until the database got rebuilt, and now it finally got rebuilt. But it's like the most absurd, like,
calm down, our small world will be okay. We'll learn
so
the matchups.
You have to understand too that we both preseason enter the schedules into our websites.
Yeah.
Or into, not me, into my website, into my
Yep.
Excel system.
Yep.
It takes a long time
Oh.
because it's 3,000 games.
Oh, very much appreciate the level, because even the level of detail we try to have in our coverage is nowhere near that level of granularity. Like it's wild. Well, and we've been talking about some really interesting source material and theoretical stuff. I think one example we could try and give folks on the ground is, let's take an example team like the Gopher soccer team. So let's take Minnesota, who's maybe, the most visible team we cover in the college side. They come in, they get a 6 seed. So I think throughout the fall, it became more clear they were going to be in the field. It even probably became clear that they were pretty likely to host, but then they land specifically as a 6 seed. So they'll be hosting, but a 6 seed. For you, when you see that announcement on Monday and you sort of see what the committee did, aside from what they did overall, what lands a team like Minnesota with their resume as a 6 in the bracket?
Let's see. First, for the top 4 seeds, historically, the poorest ranked team to get a top 4 seed is number 26. Okay, so.
And when you say rank, you mean RPI rank?
RPI rank,
Yep.
right? Number 26.
Yep.
So, actually, for the number 1 seeds, the range is 1 to 7.
Yep.
For the 2s, it's up to 14.
Yep.
For the 3s, it's up to 23, and for the 4s, it's up to 26.
Yep.
So once they've seeded all those teams, then they're looking, okay, what about the 5, 6, 7, and 8s, which they've only done. This is only the 3rd year they've done them. So there's not a lot of historic data. But the poorest ranked team that the committee has given 5 through 8 seed is number 49.
Right.
So you can think of that as that's the pool from which the 5, 6, 7s, and 8s are going to come, whoever's left.
Yeah. And this is for those who haven't seen Chris's website, he's basically very eloquently speaking the way his sheet looks visually. So I've loved the way you build your sheet, where you basically show a band of what's in. So it's not predicting the seed, it's like predicting the likelihood of the possibility, which is like sort of a nice sophisticated way to do it.
Right. Who are the candidates?
Partly, Chris, they have to work them into how they can be hosted and how it works with matchups. Is that why you're saying like a team with a certain criteria can be a 2 seed or a 3 or a 4? That's why there's certain flexibility in terms of the logistics of it.
Yes, and let me add one other thing and sort of restate how one might think about that. The poorest ranked team to ever get an at-large selection is number 57.
Yep.
So that's the group there. So for the tournament, you're thinking about the top 57, and if you're a coach, that's where you want to be.
Right.
A way to think about those ranges I was describing is that describes the teams who are potential candidates.
Right.
For something, and they use the RPI, or at least for practical purposes, you can use the RPI to identify those candidates. Once they've been identified, the committee starts looking at the details of teams' records.
Yep.
Who have they played? Who have they beaten? So when you get to Minnesota this year, their RPI rank was 29. So they're just outside the range of teams that could get a 1 through 4 seed, but they're in the range for teams that could get a 5, 6, 7, or 8.
Right.
Based on what the committee's done the last 2 years, I had identified a factor that was best at predicting who would get those seeds, the 5 through 8 seeds. And this year, I just used that factor to put them all in order.
Right.
The ones that weren't seeded that were in the top 49.
Right.
And I ended up using that factor to have Minnesota with a predicted 8 seed.
Right.
But the committee gave them a 6.
Yep.
So I looked at, based on something else that we'll get to talk about, which is how they made the final at-large decisions.
Yep.
I looked to see what Minnesota's best win was,
Right.
because it appeared to me that this year the committee was really focused on teams' best wins.
Right.
And Minnesota's best win was against Iowa,
Yep.
which is in the final ranks is number 11 and is a number 3 seed.
Yep.
And I am guessing that that is a good explanation for why they got a 6 seed. They might have gotten a 5. They were out of the range for a 4.
Right.
So with that win, that's a really good win. You would expect them to be pretty high in the 5 through 8
Right.
range. So that's the best guess I could come up with.
Right.
There was something interesting. This relates to looking at their best win.
Yeah.
Which was when the committee adopted the revised bonuses.
Yep.
The bonuses for wins, the way the order of the bonuses is the best bonuses are for wins against 1 to 25.
Yep.
The second best are for wins against 26 to 50.
Yep.
The third best are for ties against 1 to 25, and the
Yep.
fourth best are for ties to 26 to 50.
Yep.
I have to confess, I don't agree with that.
Right.
I think a tie against the number 1 team is way better than a win against the number 26 team.
Right.
But I think that is a signal that the committee considers wins
Right.
as way more significant than ties, even if the ties are against better teams. So that,
Right.
I think, is part of the explanation for why Minnesota maybe did better than
Right.
the other metric I was using would have indicated.
Right. And the example for the very specific Gopher example there would be they go out on the road, they get a tie against USC, which is like a highly ranked team, but their win against Ohio State, which maybe is more like top 25 RPI now. So it's like how you compare the win versus the tie. You're saying they're weighting it slightly heavier towards the win, even though for the Gophers to go get a tie at USC was a monumental point.
Absolutely.
Right.
Like I would have considered that way better. I would have considered that significantly better than a win against Iowa.
Right.
At number 11.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and it's funny too, because I think you probably have an even better appreciation of this than me. But when I try to describe to someone what college soccer is like in terms of the tiers, like historically the Gophers for the last few years have been like anywhere from like 60 to 80 or 70 to 100 in RPI. And they've been a solid team. They've been around 500. They win some games in the Big Ten. They maybe even make the Big Ten tournament. And they're a tough team to beat. They can play against a top team. But I try to tell people the tiers in college soccer are both not linear and they're not the same size. Like the tier from 1 to 25 is not the same as 25 to 50 or 50 to 75. Like, all the teams from like 30 to 100 could vaguely be similar based on matchup. And then as soon as you get towards the top, it gets so steep. Like because the very, very best teams are so unbelievably good that like the tiering, we cover teams that are in, we can't hear you, Mark.
Like 75 to 150 or, is like,
Yes.
you could clump a huge middle,
Yeah.
Or after you get past that first, like you said, the slope is so different. And then there's a bottom tier, but the middle is humongous and teams can move from 200 to 100, anyway.
The NCAA staff has actually said something along that line. At one point, I keep these things in a file somewhere in case I need them to confront the staff with. At one point, they said that they were answering a hypothetical question, how accurate are the RPI rankings? And they said, well, generally, they're accurate within 20 positions.
Right.
But they said, it depends on where you are in the rankings. And that's exactly right. At the top of the rankings, they're pretty good.
Yep.
You get in, as soon as you get out of the top 20, 25, you start having bigger gaps. And actually, the number 27 team last year with South Alabama did not get into the tournament. So you have and then at some year, the number 57 team got in. So that's a
Yep.
30 team spread.
Yep. That's
And
huge.
if you get up around 100 or 150, you could have a 40 or 50 team spread, and the rate rankings don't make that much difference.
One really good example for folks is when I'm doing my game prep, either for games I'm broadcasting or for just checking where Big Ten teams are or Summit League teams are, because we have a lot of Summit League teams up here. You start to see, like Mark kind of mentioned, you see teams that are in the top 100, and that kind of means something to us. And then if you're in the top 50, that kind of signals something. But by the time you're at a certain level, you have to take all of it with pretty big grains of salt. Like Northwestern was a team the Gophers played, and they played them tight, and Northwestern played above what they were on paper, but Northwestern had lost 3 games in the last 5 minutes. I mean, like really kooky, bad, terrible results where that just sinks you. Like you're all of a sudden in a Big Ten schedule, and the same can be true in any conference. It's like a team can be better on the day, and that's why you mentioned sort of the RPI being accurate up top, just in part because like the sample gets bigger and everything is tighter and all that. And I'm curious too, we've hinted at it a few times, but there's been a few sort of broad takeaways with the at-large process in particular, and with the tournament field. I've seen like folks we all follow have been mentioning it. What are some of the sort of big takeaways, both about how they did the at-large selection, but even just anything else you think really stuck out about, the selection this year?
Mm-hmm. I'll do a little description first of how I myself project what I think the committee is going to do based strictly on its past history.
Yep.
Based on the criteria, the NCAA gives the committee specific criteria it has to use for the at-large selections.
Mm-hmm.
The big one is the RPI, but then it's head-to-head results against common opponents. Those are the key ones.
Yep.
There's a non-conference RPI, which only considers non-conference games.
Yep.
And there's conference standings, both how you did in the conference tournament, how you did in the regular season, and where your conference stands in the overall conference ranks.
Mm-hmm.
So I developed a bunch of criteria, each of which has a scoring system or a bunch of factors.
Yep.
And for the teams, my system assigns each of them a score for each factor.
Mm-hmm.
And then I look at, for each I look to see, for each factor, I can say, like, I'll just use RPI rank as an example.
Right.
For the team that is first in the RPI rankings,
mm-hmm.
it always has gotten the number 1 seed.
Right.
For teams that are ranked 8 or poorer, they never have gotten a number 1 seed.
Right.
So for the number 1 seed, I have a yes standard, which is ranked number 1. I have a no standard ranked 8 or poorer.
Right.
So I used this year a list of about 80 factors.
Mm-hmm.
And my computer evaluates each team on each factor
mm-hmm.
and says, for at-large, for example, do you meet any yes at-large factors? Yes.
Yeah.
Do you meet any no at-large factors? Some do.
Mm-hmm.
Some teams, I update these factors every year to make them so they're always consistent with past history.
Yeah.
But every year I get some teams that meet some yes and some no factors. What that means is they have a profile that the committee has never seen before.
Oh, okay.
Which is not unusual, given that there's almost an infinite number of profiles that teams could have.
Right. And 80 factors. Right.
Right. Some teams meet only yes factors.
Mm-hmm.
Some teams meet only no factors. And so the teams that only meet yes factors, I assign a yes decision. Right. Yes, you're going to get an at-large selection.
Right.
Some teams don't meet any yes factors and they don't meet any no factors. And what that means is they could get a selection.
Yeah.
So what I do is at the end of the season, I do this weekly during the season and predict
Yeah.
what the committee's going to do. But at the end of the season, I look and say, okay, the teams that meet only yes factors, they get at-large positions.
Mm-hmm.
The teams that meet both yes and no factors are a new profile. They could or they could not. They go into the final pool.
Right.
And the teams that meet no yes and no factors are the possibilities. They go into the pool. And I may add a team or two that meets no yes factors and only one or two no factors, because
Right.
in the past the committee has leaked over sometimes.
Right.
So I did that this year, and I came up with a group of teams
Yep.
and predicted out of that. Oh, and then, so that's part of the process.
Yep.
The next process is, once I've done that, I've done a study of the teams that are in that final pool and which of the factors by itself, of all those factors, is the best at predicting which ones the committee will choose.
Yeah.
So I did that this year, and I had, of the final group, I had Liberty in, Pittsburgh in, Boise State in, and Xavier in.
Yep.
Now, they all did not get at-large selections.
Right.
The list also did include Cal, Washington, Colorado, and LSU.
Mm-hmm.
I think LSU had one no factor, but the others were 0-0s, as I recall.
Yep.
And the committee put all of those in.
Mm-hmm.
So since I had those in the final pool, I would say the committee didn't do anything unusual.
Right.
That kind of thing happens. You know, they got to make those decisions.
Right.
But I was curious, is there any factor that might explain why the committee did that?
Yeah.
Well, there weren't any of my factors that described that.
Right.
But I remembered that the committee this time, the reason they went to the new bonus and penalty system was they were trying to communicate how they really thought about things.
Yep.
So I remembered that. And I remembered the committee in the bonus and penalty system, they've adopted values wins really highly.
Yep.
Well, if you look at those 8 teams, the 4 that were in and the 4 that were out, the ones that were in all had better, their best wins were better than the best wins of the 4 that were out.
Right.
So I don't know if that's what the committee really was thinking, but it would be consistent with the committee wanting to signal that what we really value is really good results.
Right. Top 50 wins, right? Like
top 50 wins, but and this was even based on the best top 50 wins.
Right. Right.
So I don't know whether that's it or not.
Yeah.
As Chris Henderson has pointed out in the last 24 hours,
Yeah.
that creates an interesting situation, because to get top 50 wins, you've got to play a significant number of top 50 games.
Yep.
In fact, I think the average number of top 50 games that teams that get at-large selections play is 9.
Right. Which basically means you have to be in a conference with top 50 teams.
Well, it means either you've got to be in a conference with a lot of top 50 teams, or your entire non-conference schedule has to be top 50 teams.
Right.
And that's a problem
Yep.
for a team like Massachusetts, whose fans are really upset.
Yeah.
Because people at least say it's difficult to get top 50 teams to play you.
Yeah. The context for equal time followers is so the Summit League, the average RPI in the Summit League is 11th best in the country out of 30 some conferences. It's a very solid mid-major conference. We cover them like crazy. A ton of Minnesotans are there. South Dakota State is coming to Minnesota at an NCAA tournament. Love them. But for example, the Summit League during the equal time era, the last handful of years, I don't believe has ever had a single team in the top 50 RPI. You know, their top teams like Denver and South Dakota State, Omaha, Oral Roberts are usually somewhere 75 to 100. And so if you're a team in the Summit League and you want to try and make the Summit League a 2-bid league, essentially by this criteria, it's almost impossible because, as Chris was mentioning, what you would have to do is build a non-conference slate that, one, you actually can get wins in, but also of teams that are all sort of possibly in that top 50. And so a Summit League team like
Well, Denver played UNC this year,
Yeah.
but you'd have to beat UNC then.
Well,
so yeah.
right. And so it just makes it sort of plays into it happening while this conference realignment is happening, plays into that challenge of, okay, are we doing a Power 4 thing and everyone else? Are we sort of living a have-nots type thing, right?
Well, I took a look before actually we started this today. Here it is. To look at the history of how many non-power conference teams have gotten into the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
To look at it historically. And only 2 got in this year. That's Georgetown and Pepperdine.
Yeah.
With at-large selections. That is the only other time there have been that few was in 2018. Mm-hmm. Last year there were 8. The year before there were 4. In 2021 there were 8. 4 in 2019, and so on. Now there were some years back longer ago when there were 10.
Right.
But that's a really low number. And to be honest, I think we have to say at this point, we don't know if that's just how it happened or if that's part of what's going to be a pattern.
Right.
The other factor in terms of teams like UMass, for example, or South Dakota State,
yep,
being able to play the requisite number of top 50 teams is travel expense.
Yeah.
And playing into that now is the whole new set of economic conditions that everybody's going to be dealing with, which may make that even worse.
Right.
So that's something that remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Otherwise, yeah.
Well, and one thing I forgot, I'm not sure if we've actually said it out loud or not. Anyone who follows this and is watching this show probably knows, but essentially, the tournament field is 64 teams. We've largely been talking about the at-large selections because that's where the subjectivity comes in. Roughly half the field is automatic bids. So when Chris mentions the sort of non-Power 4, non-Power 5 teams making the tournament, the reason those numbers might feel even smaller than you would have guessed is because, the non-Power 5 teams making the tournament are coming in through automatic bids. So they're not being selected. They couldn't be selected. So just for folks to have perspective, I don't know if we ever mention it explicitly. So just naming it too.
Yeah. So this year there actually are 4 non-Power 5 teams in the conference because Santa Clara and UConn are in.
Right.
That's right.
Well, then I'm curious.
Both huge programs, though, to say like non-power, but those are big schools.
Well, Santa Clara, a longtime women's soccer power, and UConn at least like a longtime big athletic department for sure. And so, Chris, I'm curious too, just because you're in this so deeply, and you've mentioned throughout the show a little bit elements you might tweak or disagree with, but what are either some other systems that you look at, either like the Balance RPI and Massey and all of that stuff, that might speak to the selection process differently, or even just if there were things you could change, what are some things you would change about how selection goes?
Well, here's the big issue. There's 2 major problems. Maybe 3 with the RPI. And it has all to do with what we talked about originally, the fact that on strength of schedule, your opponent's record is weighted at 80% within the strength of schedule element, and who they played is only 20%. So all that really matters is what your opponent's winning percentage is.
Right.
The effect of that is that the RPI discriminates against teams from stronger conferences.
Right.
And there's a second effect of that which is if you're in a region that has a lot of parity, it's harder to find opponents with good winning percentages. Mm-hmm. So it discriminates against you too.
Right.
And interestingly, in the West and in the middle region of the country, those two geographic regions, teams tend to, that's where your playing pool is, basically.
Right.
They both have higher degrees of parity than the North and the South.
Mm-hmm.
And so you end up finding a conference like the Big Ten, which is mostly teams from the middle region,
Right.
getting pretty heavily discriminated against. In fact, that conference, their performance outperforms their ratings by more than any other conference.
Right.
So they've sort of got a double whammy. They're a strong conference, so they're being discriminated against. And they're in a region with a relatively high degree of parity. So it's hard to find good opponents
Right.
to play. And,
Right.
it's sort of like everybody would love to play South Dakota State because they almost always have a really good winning percentage.
Yep.
Now, the problem with that is, of course, if South Dakota State played everybody, it wouldn't have that good a winning percentage anymore.
Yeah. Right.
So that's part of the game. So that's the other so that's one problem. The other problem is if I have a team from a mid-major rated number 55 and a team from a power conference rated 56,
Mm-hmm.
the team from the power conference has its rating based mostly on its strength of schedule. Its winning percentage isn't going to be that good, but it'll have a really good strength of schedule. Its opponents have good winning percentages because they're teams in its conference. Mm-hmm. If you're the not Power 5 conference team, you're going to you're relying for your rating on your winning percentage.
Right.
Because your conference opponents aren't going to have that good winning percentages.
Mm-hmm.
So the better team to play always is the team from the mid-major, not the team from the power conference.
Mm-hmm.
If you're wanting to beef up your strength, your RPI rating.
Right.
The other thing is, and this relates to what the Summit League could do.
Yep.
And I actually suggest this to conferences.
Yeah.
In the Summit League, if they're really honest with themselves about it, they have teams that are potential at-large teams, or they think they do, and they have teams there's no way they're getting in the tournament. The teams for which there's no way to get in the tournament should schedule weak opponents and beef up their winning percentages.
Right.
The teams that could get in the tournament should do that to some extent, but they need to be in their non-conference scheduling, schedule enough strong opponents they can get that good win.
Right.
It seems to be so important.
Right.
And I've actually run scenarios for conferences with this. I think I did it for the Big East years ago.
Yeah.
And I showed them that if I could do their schedule, I could elevate. I think the Big East, I elevated to being the number one average RPI conference in the nation. Now, it takes the coaches being willing to cooperate.
Sure.
And part of the reason it does that is everybody then comes into conference play with a good strength of schedule.
Right.
And they pass that on to all of their other conference compatriots.
Yep.
And so they all elevate their rankings.
Right.
Some of them who really aren't top 50 teams end up in the top 50.
Yep.
And so you've now played more top 50 opponents.
Right.
And the other thing, which I think if coaches were doing it, it would do for the teams is it would help with their recruiting.
Yeah.
Because now we're not a number 80 team, we're a number 60 team, or we're not 150, we're 100.
Right.
Now, the ability to do that is actually why the NCAA got rid of the RPI for basketball.
Yeah.
And I know that because Mark Few, who's the great Gonzaga coach, was on the committee that led the effort to get rid of it.
Yeah.
And he specifically said the problem with the RPI is teams and even conferences
It's
can
gameable.
trick the system.
And
Right.
Chris read those minutes, Matt. That's how he knows. It is how, honestly, this is how people get accountable. That, yeah, I love it. Reading the minutes. This, I assume so, as much, but yeah,
I
gotta
think
get into it.
I think people don't appreciate if Chris didn't live 2 time zones away, Mark and I we would have Chris hanging out at Blackheart with us 3 times a week. We would be this is amazing. This is great insight. Well, and even you mentioning the conference strategy, it is so interesting because in a sense, when you talk about the 50-50 split of RPI, but then within that opponent 50, it's 80-20, really you could splice it down into really 3 distinct pieces even. But that weight on the opponent win percentage is so interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking through the Gophers schedule. And then as you were talking, I was thinking through St. Thomas's schedule. I'm like imagining sort of the way, because I think, to be honest with you, like coaches do think about this, but I think they also think about other very random things, things like, we already have 2 road trips. Like we can't, there's a lot of human element they put into it. And I also think people forget there's a weird mix of well ahead of time and last minute when it comes to scheduling. So like, for instance, programs build their schedules well in advance in terms of non-conference, but sometimes those things also crumble at the last minute, and then it's very last minute. So it's a weird, bizarre mix of, we set up a home and home with Georgia, and so we're doing a home and home with Georgia in 25 and 26. But then we also have a last minute thing where the coach at X program changed, and so now we're not playing Marquette. Now we need a game. Oh shit, we have to go get an opponent, whatever. So it's a very weird, like you mentioned the intentionality, and I think there is a lot of intentionality, but there's also weird, bizarre chaos to it that I think is sort of interesting.
Well, those things happen. Penn State actually played a D3 team, I think, this year. Now that doesn't count in the NCAA process. And people were, why the heck are they doing that? Well, I happen to know because they lost the game at the last minute.
Right.
And they wanted their players to be able to play. But another example of that, which drove me crazy initially, I am a University of Portland fan.
Yep.
There are 3 colleges in the country that are in the same Catholic religious order: U of P, Notre Dame, and Stonehill, which is in New York, I think, and is a new entry, was last year to Division I. Well, Stonehill begged and pleaded with the administration at the University of Portland to be able to play U of P. And they played them last year, and it's like, they were like 1-16. That's a disaster. But they have this, they call it the Anchor and Cross Classic or something like that. They named it, and they played again this year. And I'm sort of like, I hope you guys aren't going to do this every year. This is really bad.
Your pilots, right, Chris?
Right.
They deserve better than that, the pilots, yeah.
Well, Stonehill actually was competing for the Northeast Conference Championship this year. They couldn't have gotten into the tournament because they haven't finished reclassification yet.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So it wasn't so bad this year, but it was like last year at the end of the year, I did an analysis and they wouldn't have gotten in the NCAA tournament anyway. So it was okay. But it's like you do have those kinds of things. Or it's like Minnesota playing St. Thomas.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's been a funny thing locally with non-women's soccer sports where sort of general sports fans are like, why won't the U play St. Thomas in basketball or in some other sport? And in other sports, coaches have held out, partly because of like the upset possibility and whatever, or I'm presuming that's why. And in women's soccer, they've played some spring games and some exhibitions and also now regular season games. And like, all respect to St. Thomas, we cover the Toms like crazy, good soccer, whatever. But it is actually the kind of thing where, like, if the Gophers are really, really stressed about their RPI and really, really stressed about that seeding, eventually you will see them avoid games like that because, like, you can get an anchor on your RPI by playing, just all respect to St. Thomas, but they're in sort of the bottom third of all D1 teams in the whole country, so it does, like you mentioned, it just creates this anchor, aside from the risk of there being a bad result, but even a win puts that into your RPI mix, so it's just, yeah.
Or just keep them as your local, non-conference game. Well, you could still have them as a game, but you have to make the other games that much more. Because I think the fans love it. I mean, it's cool. It's cool for the soccer community, but it's a no-win for the Ghosts because if they lose or tie, it's just lost. Yeah.
Well, and Chris, we've taken a ton of your time. This has been super, super interesting. For those who haven't followed Chris's stuff, we share it on social all the time. We'll continue sharing it, but we put it in his name down there, RPI for D1 Women's Soccer, W Soccer. We'll make sure we share it again. I mean, I just cannot say enough about the work you do. We got into this because we thought, women's soccer players deserve to be amplified. They deserve to be covered. And part of that coverage is the stuff you're doing because you unlock a level of analysis by coaches, conferences, but also folks like us who try and amplify these players. And so what you do is so important and so valuable to us. And so, really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, this guy responded to a cold email from someone he'd never met in his entire life and came on and shared, 60 full minutes of expertise. Cannot say enough for you coming on, Chris. Thanks so much.
Happy to do it.
We're gonna get him into the Twin Cities. We're gonna get him to the Blackheart, or we're gonna get out to Portland. We'll hang out with this guy. Don't worry.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, buddy.
Thanks so much.
You.
Oh wow,
cool.
That was super, super informative. I mean, we talk about the Gophers this year being sort of a firm at large bid, and so it makes it less confusing, a little less confusing, but the way he describes some of that, even knowing the 80-20 formula,
that's
is just
crazy.
So helpful.
That's pretty wild. Yeah, that is something.
Also, shout out, Mark and I have both either worked in politics or government before, or in political spaces. When he was describing having to go into the bowels of the NCAA.org website, it reminded me so much of the silly data dives we've had to do.
Reading laws. Thankfully I was never that deep, but having to dig in for constituents. Yes, absolutely memories. But
well, and let's do some end of the show updates. Obviously the NCAA tournament is starting on Friday. Minnesota hosts South Dakota State, but there are a ton of other Minnesotans in the national tournament. Mark, let's dive into a little bit of that.
Yeah. I mean, anchored by the fact that the Gophers are back in. It's been years. Obviously, really cool for the Gopher fans who they always show up to games. It's a competitive team. They are back in hosting, which is awesome. So 14 Minnesotans on Minnesota anchor the fact that we have 35 in the NCAA. So for folks who don't follow, we'll post a D1 update probably tomorrow with players and all their stats up through the conference tournaments. We have 125 players. So pretty cool that of 125, 35 are in the tournament. Obviously, like I said, the Gophers carrying the most of that, but South Dakota State and Wisconsin both have 5 with core players who make it work. Iowa with 2, Cal Baptist, UNC with all 2 players who play a lot. And then Penn State, Wake, TCU, Notre Dame, Kentucky, Milwaukee, all have 1 each. Matt and I have been saying it is a bit unprecedented in the time that we're aware of. There's been other times in Minnesota women's soccer, but in the time we've been doing this, really fun to see so many people with a chance. Sometimes we had to reach in other years. We don't have to reach. There's teams that are going to be playing.
Well, and within that group, there's some teams that have very real chances to make runs. So it's not just sort of, oh, nice to be here. Multiple teams in that group have a chance to get some wins, and a lot of them are already tournament tested. And so I think there's a chance you see some of these Minnesotans make deep runs the same way we got to see sort of Maddie Deline last year, Caitlin McBean at Penn State. Now, Izzy Engel at Notre Dame, Megan Flashko at TCU.
And we'll run through every game because it's kind of nice. It's simple. It seems like every game is on ESPN Plus, so we'll run through it. But more contenders than ever. I remember we'd be mentioning teams with someone who doesn't play the last couple years. They are just players this year.
Well, and this year in particular, we've seen a lot, even we've highlighted a lot of the offensive explosion just because some of the leading scorers in the whole country have been Minnesotans. But overall, what have we been seeing from sort of attackers from Minnesota?
Yeah, it is. We are heavy in terms of the teams that made the tournament. We are kind of heavy on attackers. I don't know if it says anything about the type of players we're exporting to D1, but it is fascinating. I think part of it is just odds. But all year we've been talking about Kaya Harper, who's been in the top But Kai Harper's been in the top 10 in goals. Izzy
Yep.
Engel, Caitlin McBean, they've all been in the top 10. They're all scoring like crazy. Paige Kalal for Minnesota has 9 assists. She's up in the top 10 in assists in the country. And then Barrett Parton at Iowa as a freshman, 10 goal contributions with 2 ghost goals that we like to joke about, but really did happen from a game called off for weather. And then Caitlin Bielke at UNI continues just producing with her squad of Minnesotans too, 7 goals, 3 assists. So we are kind of heavy on, we also have a lot of keepers, but like heavy on offensive output in terms of who's standing out for us, at least to see.
Yeah. Well, and I think Belke, I think we're going to see on Friday. I think that's a jackrabbit. That's a South Dakota State.
Oh, might be. Yeah.
But folks will get to see her at ELR, South Dakota State coming to Minnesota, like we've mentioned on social. But that's going to be super, super fun.
Yeah.
And even some defenders, a little fewer. You know, Catherine Jones is kind of in between, kind of like a central midfielder. She's been just such a mainstay. But even, you know, couple of defenders, just the Gophers, right?
It's really just Ashley Turk and Yelena Zabilich, who play close to 90 for the U. Erin Chastain has had a heavy reliability on her back line and for some other players too. And so, they play a ton. But for whatever reason this year, less in terms of, unless we had some people misdescribed and they were playing a bunch, it is a year where we're more in the front, and then we have the keepers. I mean, like we've had 4 keepers or more being really mainstays all year, carrying into the tournament now still. Sarah Martin at Minnesota, a sophomore who didn't play before this year, has been crushing it for a team that's returned to the postseason, you know, for the first time in a few years. Claire Gagne, of course, at UNC we had on earlier this year, destroying. She's played the most games by nature of the team making it through the tournament. And she continues to just be relied upon. Megan Plashko at TCU was a Gopher reliable keeper for years and years, solid for them. And then Emma Knack at South Dakota State, they have a keeper partnership. She has a bit of the edge in getting some more of it. I do wonder if they'll still split. I think they're going to
be. I think they're still splitting. Yeah.
You would think. And then Peyton Cahill, a backup at Wake, who played a little bit earlier this year. So heavy on solid keepers.
Some bonus points for some Minnesota Aurora players who have all made it in. We got Eli and Kat Rapp down at FIU, who made it through, I believe, Conference USA. Down at Kansas, actually a pretty real upset. Kansas took down TCU in the Big 12 tournament. Asa Kante and Sage Wimes, who Sage, you know, Asa wasn't able to play for Aurora, but she was up here training. Wimes was a super dynamic attacker. And then Utah State, the longtime contingent from Utah State. We got Wickers, we got Olson, we got Kiki, she's their striker up top, had a clutch goal for the Aggies. They're going to be hosting, so shout out to Utah State.
Nice.
And then some early games for this first round, right, Mark?
Yeah, no, I love the simplicity of it being ESPN Plus. So for people, if you are in Minnesota or in the Twin Cities especially, go to Elizabeth Lyle Robbie Stadium to watch the Gophers for South Dakota State. If you can't for whatever reason, or if you're just so addicted to bingo, you have to come play bingo here at the Blackheart where I am going to put it on TVs here because it's too quick for me to go from the stadium to the bar to work that night. For Dragged Out featuring Dick Von Dyke. If you want to come to it, you can come watch the Gophers here, see a drag show. But yes, amazing that the Gophers are hosting South Dakota State. Super Minnesota matchup. These are Friday, November 15th. They play at 6 p.m. The earliest game is UNC playing South Carolina upstate at 5 p.m. Expect UNC to kind of roll through that. We mentioned FIU with the Rapp sisters, 2 of the 3 triplets. They play Auburn, 6 p.m. Iowa plays Missouri State at 6 p.m. Notre Dame and Milwaukee. Milwaukee as a freshman. DeRosier from Minnesota. That's at 6 p.m. And Izzy Engel, of course. Wisconsin plays Maine. Give odds to Wisconsin to win that one. 7 p.m. TCU faces Stephen F. Austin, 7 p.m. Odds for Plashko to go through on that. And then Cal Baptist with the Westland partnership going up against UCLA. That's tough. I think Ava just had a couple goals and assists in the last few games. So good for her, but good for them just to be there, but tough challenge. Take it to UCLA. And then Saturday, Penn State, Caitlin Caitlin McBean faces Stony Brook at 5 p.m. So ESPN Plus is your place. If you don't have it, as these rounds continue, feel free to come into the bar. But yeah, I'm excited to watch it. And we have so many more people really contending this year. You'd expect so many teams to make it to the second round.
And if somehow you are through all of this and you still need more soccer, we got the D2 NSIC tournament in Minnesota. Mark and I did a whip around on Monday for the opening round. Concordia had a quality win against Bemidji. Minnesota State Mankato beat Wayne. Minot beat Augie, and Mary beat St. Cloud. So those 4 teams, so Concordia versus Minot and Minnesota State Mankato versus Mary, are playing midday games on Friday. We won't be able to be there on the ground, but I will post highlights.
I think I actually will, because that's time I'll be free. But we'll see. I'll see what I can get out of those.
Great.
We'll see how cold it is.
And then on
the CSP, at least I can try to be there. We'll see.
Yeah, and then on Friday is the final. I will try to be there Sunday is the final. I'll try to be there. That'll be at 1 p.m. It's a lot of the bubble possibilities in D2 are still sort of on the line. We could see a team that's outside that large really win this thing. So small chance of 4 NSIC teams making it.
As of now, looking likely for Minnesota State Mankato, for St. Cloud State, and for Concordia. But if Minot made their run, then theoretically they could take the at large. But that was fun to do last week. But
Well, thanks so much, guys, for joining us. Follow us on social for the rest of it. Thanks to Pentz Homes for their ongoing support. If you tuned in and want to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/equaltimesoccer. Otherwise, just
the numbers got higher as we went, so I guess people weren't getting disappointed. But
that's because we had Chris on. We had the big dog on. That's why.
Come watch the college soccer here. You can watch NWSL at the Blackheart this weekend as well. Super League, whatever you got, man. We're watching it all this weekend.
All right. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.